Every time I turn around, there's another IEM. How is it possible for companies to release these products at a breakneck speed? Well, here's another IEM, this time from a manufacturer I have never heard of before. This is the Geek Wold GK10. This IEM costs just under $50. Hi-Fi Go sent me the GK10 for review. Hi-Fi Go is one among very few resellers that specialize in hi-fi gear with distribution within the United States. If you're looking for some exotic or unusual stuff along with the traditional, check Hi-Fi Go's website. So, is the GK10 amazing in every way, a competent contender in an already oversaturated market, or a complete waste? Geek Wold says that the GK10 is a 5 hybrid driver IEM. It has 1 balanced armature, 2 dynamic drivers, and 2 piezoelectric drivers. The marketing says that the GK10's drivers will provide greatly improved high-frequency response. It claims that this IEM will have broad soundstage and rich details in the high frequency. The GK10 supposedly has excellent bass. The marketing says a lot of mumbo-jumbo. For example, the GK10's bass apparently has, quote, good elasticity and can dive deep. Geek Wold promises strong bass response. Geek Wold says that the GK10 will provide a natural and smooth sound connection, bringing you a relaxing and comfortable sound experience. Geek World obviously is not clear about the performance or sound signature. On the one hand, they strongly imply a V-shaped signature. On the other hand, they suggest a natural and smooth, relaxing sound. And to be perfectly honest, V-shaped tuning usually does not present itself this way. I guess we'll just have to figure it out ourselves. The GK10 is, well, it is heart-shaped. I don't know why. This isn't the design I would have chosen, but it is certainly different from the ocean of IEMs in the market. The GK10 is built primarily of plastic. It's sturdy, however. The housing is smooth and does not have sharp edges. The housing has a wood panel insert in the middle. To the touch, the wood panel feels a little bit like plastic, but that's probably some coating on top. Surprisingly, the shape of the GK10 is contoured for ears. It will sit within the ear cavity. I imagine this would be a problem, given this IEM's unusual design, but actually it turned out to be a non-issue. The GK10 comes with a detachable 2-pin cable. This cable is thick, prone to some microphonics, but otherwise feels quite sturdy. I have seen cheaper cables from IEMs in this price range and higher. The GK10 comes with several ear tips and a carrying pouch. The ear tips are fairly comfortable. You only get silicone, however. The carrying pouch is a reasonable addition. It seems to be well made and is easier to carry in a pocket than IEM cases. As for comfort, the GK10 is about average in my opinion. I was never able to dislodge this IEM despite jumping up and down and shaking my head vigorously. The ear tips make a very good seal, so good in fact that most external noises are muffled by a considerable degree. I can wear the GK10 for about 2 hours without fatigue. Overall, the GK10 is not going to win any awards for its build, accessories, or comfort. While the design is odd, it works. I'm glad to see that the bundled accessories are at least decent. This once again highlights that Blonde's IEMs are shipped with incredibly subpar ear tips and cables, a problem that few other IEMs seem to have. I tested the sound signature of the GK10 using various devices. This included my Modi and Liquid Spark stack, the Ibasso DX160, and the RME ADI2 DAC. I used the stock accessories. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. I will say at the outset that the GK10 is easy to drive. Any mobile device should have plenty of power. Using an amplifier does not seem to make material differences. Geek World says that the GK10 has powerful bass. It appears to me that the GK10 has a significant bass emphasis. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, there's a lingering rumble from the beginning of the track. The GK10 easily made that audible and elevated it quite noticeably. The decay was a bit slower than what I heard on the neutral Moondrop Quarks. There was considerable melding between sub-bass and mid-bass. During the crescendo, the organ was shoulder to shoulder with the other instruments, and the organ is actually supposed to cut right through them. The rolling thunder effect at this point was elevated, but not distorted. The vocals rose from the background until they were shoulder to shoulder with the instruments. In Conquer by Overwork, there's a rolling marble effect at the beginning. This detail is supposed to pan from right to left to center. The GK10 did present the sound of rolling marbles, but not the panning. There are multiple drums in this track, and the GK10 presented all of them. They were clearly elevated. Each drum strike melded with the next. The drum strike sounded a little blunted, as if there was a thin sheet in front of the speaker. There was no sharp thwacking of drumsticks hitting drum heads. However, the synth sounded smooth. I listened to several hip-hop songs including Pure Water, New Patek, Reel It In, and Uproar. With every song, the GK10 significantly emphasized the bass. The sub-bass, it seemed to me, was several decibels above neutral. It was as if the subwoofer was only a few feet away from me. There was noticeable melding between sub-bass and mid-bass, resulting in drums not standing out among the bass rumble. Vocals were about one step ahead of the instruments. I listened to my Sicario playlist. I used these songs to determine if there is an audible distortion in the sub-bass. Two things stood out to me about the GK10 in this test. First, the sub-bass was significantly elevated. Usually, to achieve similar bass presence, I would have to increase power to beyond safe listening volumes when using neutral IEMs or those with a bass roll-off. But the GK10 presented the rumble and all its reverberation at moderate volumes. The second thing I noticed was that the GK10 never distorted. Overall, when Geek Wold says that the GK10 has powerful bass, yes, I think they are correct. There is clearly a bass emphasis. Sub-bass and mid-bass meld. There is less than average clarity in this region. Decay is generally a bit slower than with more neutral IEMs. However, the bass does not distort. If you want rumble and thumping bass, then the GK10 seems to fit that profile. Geek Wold does not say what the mids should sound like on the GK10. It seems to me that they are recessed, often overridden by the bass. In Why Am I Like This by Orla Gartland, there is natural vocal grain and sibilance mixed into the track. The GK10 accentuated both details considerably. The sibilance was almost as harsh as on the HD560S. The vocal grain was emphasized well above neutral. This made listening to the song at even moderate volumes a bit difficult. Although the drums and guitar appeared to have natural timbre, there was considerable melding between them. Orla's voice was at best shoulder to shoulder with the instruments, but the drums were typically louder. In Want You Back by Haim, the GK10 again showed it significantly emphasizes sibilance, to the same or similar degree as the HD560S, if I might add. At 8 seconds into the song, the primary vocalist says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The GK10 did recreate this detail clearly. There are two backup vocalists who are snapping fingers as they sing. Initially, the GK10 clearly separated all the vocalists and provided the snapping of fingers. However, when the instruments played at maximum, the backup vocalists melded into one voice, and the vocals seemed to be recessed behind the drums. The guitar, bass, drums, and piano all seemed to have correct timbre, but the drums usually were louder than all of them. There was noticeable melding among instruments. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the GK10 did present the ukulele, drums, and bass. However, the bass was elevated and notes from all instruments melded together. There's a backup vocalist whose voice is layered beneath the primaries. The GK10 could not separate this detail, but I have to add, this is typical for a lot of headphones and IEMs. The GK10 emphasized the sibilance in the primary vocalist's voice. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are supposed to be sharp intakes of breaths. The GK10 did recreate this detail. Overall, the mids are recessed. Bass bleeds into the mids, resulting in less than average clarity. Instruments tend to meld. The GK10 significantly elevates vocal grain and sibilance, particularly in female vocals. Some might consider the GK10's rendition as shouty vocals. Geek World says that the GK10 has extended treble and detail in this region. In my experience, the GK10 elevated treble that does not become piercing. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the brass and horns cut through the mix on the GK10. Their nasally signatures were unmistakable. The timpani was elevated but did not drown out the other instruments. I could hear group sets but not individual instruments. All treble instruments appeared to have additional energy on the GK10 than they did on the more neutral Moondrop Quarks. This never became harsh, however. The GK10 has very limited ability to render width. That is, some instruments sound a bit further away than others. However, there is no sense of depth or verticality. In Fly from the City, the GK10 made the piano sound like it was 3 feet away. The bassy notes were clearly elevated and melded with each other. I could hear the pops and sizzles and electric buzzing, two details that are in the bass layer of this track. The cello seemed smooth but also melded heavily with the piano. I could hear the creaking of wood on the pianist's bench and the shifting of the cello's weight. All of the minute details I have mentioned so far get drowned out when bassy notes are being played. In Take 5 of the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the GK10 presented the piano in the right, drums in the left, saxophone center, and the bass one step behind. The cymbals were as loud as the saxophone and sometimes just a little bit louder. Both were elevated above neutral. All instruments tended to meld. Overall, the GK10 has elevated treble. It is not harsh or piercing, but it is clearly a deviation from neutral. While Geek Wold says the treble has detail, my experience is that whenever bassy instruments are playing, those treble details get drowned out a little bit. Moreover, the treble emphasis elevates some instruments so that they are louder than principal elements in a track, such as cymbals becoming louder than the saxophone in a mix. It should be apparent by now that the GK10 does not excel at detail. In fact, I would say it does an average job at best. Part of the issue is that the GK10 is simply not clear. The bass lacks detail, the sub-bass and mid-bass tend to meld, which means any details that might be present in the bass region are lost. The mids are recessed, and whenever bassy instruments are involved, details in the mids get muffled. And while treble is a little clearer than the bass and mids, the GK10 did not consistently reveal minute details. For a more quantitative test, I used the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of details, including the sound of children playing, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of footsteps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The Blonde BL03 presents 5 to 6 footsteps. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 presents 7 to 8. The T2 Plus and Blonde BL05 each present 6 to 7. The Heidi's MS2 presents 8 to 9. The Moondrop Starfield presents 6. The Moondrop Aria presents 7. The T Audio Legacy 2 provides 6 to 7 footsteps. The Moondrop Quarks provides 5 to 6 footsteps. The GK10 provides 5 to 6 footsteps. In the list of IEMs I just mentioned, the GK10 does not stand out as a detail monster. In fact, it is fairly mediocre. The $13 Moondrop Quarks has as much detail retrieval as the GK10, and the GK10 has as much detail as the Blonde BL03. Geek Wold says that the GK10 has broad soundstage. I don't know what this means, but I can say without a doubt that the GK10 has average at best soundstage. The GK10 does not have verticality or depth. There is some width. You can forget about a 3D effect on this IEM. For the sake of comparison, let's talk about soundstage of other IEMs. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 has above average soundstage. The Heidi's MS2 is similar to the T2. The Blonde BL03 and 05S are average at best and perhaps slightly below average in soundstage based on proper fit. The Starfield, Aria, and Quarks are about average. In my opinion, I think that the GK10 has about as much soundstage as the Blonde BL03, average at best and slightly below. Keep in mind that ear tips and original recording make a significant difference in soundstage experience. Geekwool says that the GK10 has natural, smooth sound, but also describes a V-shaped signature. I think the V-shaped idea is true. The GK10 has a significant bass emphasis. There's little clarity in this region, and both the sub-bass and mid-bass meld. The bass bleeds into the mids. The mids are recessed. Vocals get a lot of grain and sibilance emphasis. The sibilance on the GK10 reminded me a lot of the HD560S, which I think is really harsh. Although timbre seems natural, there are so much melding among instruments that you often lose minute details in complex tracks. The treble is emphasized, but not harsh or piercing. Some treble instruments are louder than others when they really should not be. For example, cymbals may sometimes sound as loud as or even louder than a saxophone. The treble region is clearer than both the bass and mids. Detail retrieval is below average. Complex tracks, or those that have more than a few instruments and vocalists, will sound muffled, recessed, or undetailed, particularly when there are bassy instruments. Minute details will be hard to hear in these circumstances. However, when listening to more simple music, when there's one or two vocals and only two instruments, the GK10 does reveal major and some minor details. The GK10 Soundstage is average at best. I cannot say that the GK10 is unnatural or not smooth, as I think that's too simplistic. Of course, no instrument sounded off timbre, vocals never had odd pitch, and some tracks did have rather smooth rendition. But this experience was inconsistent. It depends, as you might guess, on a lot on the music you listen to. There are some IEMs and headphones that make any track you play sound smooth and natural, but I do not get that feeling from the GK10. You cannot rely on these IEMs to always sound smooth or natural. After all, it is decidedly not smooth when vocal grain and sibilance is close to being harsh and you have to reduce volume to continue listening. And it is not particularly natural when cymbals drown out or sound as loud as principal instruments in a mix. If you listen to tracks that do not emphasize bass and rarely listen to rock or jazz, then I think Geek World's claims about natural and smooth sound might be closer to the truth. Ultimately, I would say that the GK10 has a traditional V-shaped signature and probably a pretty aggressive one. In order to understand where products are situated, we need to do A/B comparisons. Here, I will compare the GK10 to the Moondrop Quarks, the Blonde BL03, and the Tin Hi-Fi T2. I plugged these IEMs into my passive A/B switch. I used the RME 80i2 DAC. All IEMs were tested with their stock accessories. I listened to my playlist on Amazon Music HD, and of course, I tried to volume match. The Quarks have noticeably more neutral bass. Going back and forth, it was evident that the Quarks provided more clarity and separation between sub-bass and mid-bass. The GK10 also has harder mid-bass impact. Decay is longer on the GK10. The Quarks have a marginal bass boost of up neutral, but the GK10 has noticeably greater emphasis. This was a night and day difference. The mids are far more neutral on the Quarks. Vocals are 1 to 2 steps ahead of instruments. While the Quarks slightly emphasize sibilance, this is much less than what the GK10 does. The Quarks do not emphasize vocal grain. The mids are generally a little clearer on the Quarks, with less melding among instruments than on the GK10. Timbre of instruments is the same on both IEMs. However, bass instruments, especially drums, tend to overshadow other elements on the GK10. Treble is slightly rolled off in the upper treble region on the Quarks. In contrast, the GK10 emphasizes treble. Both appear to be equally clear in this region. Both IEMs exhibit the same amount of detail, but the Quarks have slightly greater soundstage. The Blonde BL03 has less sub-bass emphasis and slightly greater separation between sub-bass and mid-bass. The GK10 has harder mid-bass impact. Transient seems to be about the same. Clarity is marginally greater on the BL03. The mids are similar. Both IEMs push vocal sibilance, and it appears to be about the same amount. Vocal grain is also fairly close between these two IEMs. On both IEMs, instruments tend to meld with each other. Neither has more clarity than the other in this region. Vocals are forward and close to the ears on both products. Treble on the GK10 is smoother and slightly less sharp than on the BL03. In fact, the BL03 exhibits more treble energy, though no better clarity. Both the GK10 and the BL03 have the same amount of detail and soundstage. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 has a bass roll-off compared to the GK10, and in fact compared to a lot of IEMs. There's no doubt that the GK10 has a significant sub-bass and mid-bass emphasis. The T2 has noticeably greater separation between sub-bass and mid-bass, and overall significantly more clarity in the bass region. Mid-bass impact is harder on the GK10. The T2 and GK10 both emphasize sibilance. This seems to be fairly close, but it appeared to be that the T2 was slightly more tame. Vocal grain was closer to neutral on the T2. Separation of mid-centric instruments was greater on the T2. Clarity overall in this region was more obvious on the T2. Timbre of instruments was the same, but decay was longer on the GK10. Treble is clearer on the T2. It is a bit emphasized, but not like the GK10. Indeed, the GK10 has more treble energy, and in comparison, the T2 is noticeably closer to neutral. Separation of treble instruments seems to be about the same. Placement seems to be a bit clearer on the T2. The T2 has more detail and soundstage. Comparisons like these help us understand how IEMs continue to measure up and whether new options in the market are providing anything new. Here, we can tell that the GK10 does do things differently from the T2, BL03, and the Quarks. All four of these IEMs represent different ways of experiencing your music. Out of these four, the GK10 is aggressively V-shaped. The BL03 is slightly less V-shaped. The T2 is a bit on the analytical side, and the Quarks are neutral. As with any other piece of gear, any of these IEMs might be to your favor, or you may hate all of them. It is seldom that I find IEMs that do things so differently that I feel compelled to use them over and over again. The T2, Aria, and Quarks are three examples of IEMs I have no qualms about using as comparison products. All three provide something very unique, particularly for their prices. But a lot of IEMs are questionable propositions. You could opt, for example, for the BL03 and end up spending double their cost to upgrade ear tips and cables because Blonde's accessories are utter garbage. The fit of Blonde's IEMs is also touch and go. Either they work for you or they don't. And that's not exactly a resounding success story. So, even though you might love the sound of a particular IEM, you may find yourself using it sparingly because of poor build, bad fit, or trash accessories, or some combination of all three. On the flip side, you may utterly hate the sound signature of an IEM, yet find that its construction, fit, and accessories are fantastic. So, whenever a new IEM comes into the playground, it needs to do things differently enough to stand out from the crowd. This brings us to the GK10's value. I can say that the GK10 does do things differently enough from other popular IEMs to at least stand out in that way. But you really have to want what it offers. The GK10's aggressive V-shaped sound signature is not going to appeal to a lot of people. But assuming that's the type of sound you want, the GK10's other aspects are pretty run-of-the-mill. The accessories are fine and certainly nothing to complain about. The construction is, odd, but surprisingly comfortable. So, is $50 value? Yes, if you want a V-shaped signature. If you are remotely sensitive to sibilance or treble, I would caution you against this IEM. If you want neutral tonality, stay far away. If you want clarity, detail, and soundstage, then there are other options at a similar price point. Ultimately, I can see that some people will be happy with the GK10 sound. So, for you, yes, I think that $50 may be value. But honestly, this IEM is not going to win awards for any technicalities. It might turn heads when people see hearts inside your ears, however.